Luke was 13 years old when this happened, and he says he will never forget that night. It was a Friday, and the air outside was cool, with leaves rustling under the wind. His parents were getting ready to leave for dinner with some family friends, so they told Luke that his older cousin Mike would be staying with him to watch the house. Mike was 17 tall and usually spent most of his time playing games on his phone. At first, Luke felt safe knowing Mike would be there because he did not like staying alone, especially in that old, creaky house. It was a small house, but it was old, with floors that groaned every time someone walked across them. The windows were thin, and the wind would whistle through them when it was quiet at night, making Luke feel like someone was sighing inside the walls. After Luke's parents left, Mike made himself a bowl of cereal while Luke watched cartoons. They were both bored, and the ticking of the wall clock felt louder with every minute. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made Luke's stomach feel weird, like something was wrong even if nothing bad was happening. Mike was scrolling on his phone, and then he suddenly looked up and said, "Hey, you want to play hide and seek?" At first, Luke was confused because they were a little too old to play that, but Mike shrugged and said it would help pass the time. Luke wanted to say no, but he didn't want Mike to call him a baby or scared, so he agreed. It was around 9 p.m. when they started. Mike turned off the TV, and the house instantly felt darker and quieter. Luke noticed the shadows on the walls dancing under the yellow light of the lamps, and he felt a small chill on his arms. Mike stood in the living room and leaned against the wall, covering his eyes with his hands. "Okay, I'll count to 30, Mike said. His voice echoed a bit in the room, and Luke felt his heart beating faster for no reason. He told himself it was just a game and there was nothing to be scared of, but the empty silence of the house made him feel like he was not alone. As Mike started counting, 1, 2, 3. Luke ran off to find a hiding spot. He passed the kitchen, where the light above the sink buzzed softly, and he tiptoed down the hallway where the floor creaked under his feet. He wanted to hide in his room under the bed, but he felt like that was too easy, and Mike would find him quickly. He thought about the basement, but it was too dark and cold, and Luke hated how it smelled like wet dirt and mold down there. So he decided to hide in the hallway closet near the bedrooms. It was a narrow closet with old coats, some shoes, and boxes stacked on the floor. It smelled like dust and old wood, but it was dark enough that he could hide behind the coats, and Mike might not see him right away. Luke slipped inside the closet, pulling the coats in front of him to cover himself. He could still hear Mike's counting 25, 26 from down the hall, and Luke tried to control his breathing so it would not be too loud. It was dark inside the closet, and a thin line of light came from the crack between the door and the frame, letting him see a little bit of the hallway floor. Luke tried to focus on that crack so he wouldn't feel scared, but the darkness inside the closet felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him. The coat smelled musty, and he could hear his own breathing, louder now, as he tried not to move. 30. "Ready or not, here I come," Mike's voice called out, and it echoed through the hallway. Luke held his breath, feeling a mix of excitement and fear, waiting to hear Mike's footsteps. At first, the house was quiet, and Luke wondered if Mike was trying to trick him by sneaking around. Then he heard the floorboards creak under Mike's feet, slow and careful steps moving from the living room into the hallway. Luke's heart started beating faster, thumping in his ears as the footsteps got closer. As Luke stood there in the dark, trying not to make a sound, he heard something else. At first, he thought it was just the house making noise, like it sometimes did when it was windy outside. But then he heard it again, and this time it was clear, a soft, slow scratching sound coming from inside the wall behind him. Luke froze, his body turning cold as he listened carefully. It was a scratching sound, like something with nails dragging against wood, slow and steady. He wanted to believe it was just a mouse, but it sounded too loud, too clear, like it was happening. Right behind his back. Luke was afraid to move, afraid that if he made a sound, whatever was inside the wall would hear him. He could feel his legs starting to shake, and he wanted to call out for Mike, but his voice felt stuck in his throat. The scratching sound stopped for a few seconds, and Luke held his breath, waiting, hoping it wouldn't start again. But then he heard it once more, this time a little faster, moving behind him along the wall. His fear started to grow inside him like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He wanted to open the closet door and run out, but he remembered that Mike was looking for him, and he didn't want to ruin the game. But the scratching sound felt like it was getting closer, like it was coming toward him through the wall. Luke closed his eyes, wishing it would stop, wishing he was downstairs watching TV with Mike again. Just then, the footsteps in the hallway stopped right in front of the closet. Luke's eyes snapped open, and he saw a shadow fall across the crack of light under the door. He held his breath, waiting for the door to open, waiting for Mike to yell, "Found you," and laugh, but the door didn't open. Everything was silent for a moment, and then he heard the soft scratching again, this time mixed with a faint, whispery sound, like someone breathing softly, right behind him inside the closet. Luke wanted to scream, but he covered his mouth with his hand to stop himself, tears starting to build in his eyes. The game was no longer fun. In that moment, hiding in the dark, Luke felt something cold brush against his back like a small breeze, but there was no vent in the closet. Then he heard a whisper, so soft that he almost thought he imagined it, but it was clear. It said, "Found you." Luke's scream echoed through the hallway as he fell out of the closet, hitting the floor hard on his side. His breathing was fast, and his chest hurt from how quickly his heart was beating. He crawled backward on the floor, looking at the closet door, expecting to see someone stepping out after him. But the door stayed still, half open, with the coats hanging quietly. The light from the hallway lamp made shadows dance on the closet door, and Luke felt like the darkness inside was staring back at him. Mike came running from the living room, his eyes wide with worry. "What happened?" he shouted, his voice loud in the quiet house. Luke was shaking, trying to get words out. "There's someone in the closet," he yelled, pointing with a trembling finger. Mike looked at the closet, then back at Luke, and for a second, Luke could tell that Mike was scared too. Mike tried to act calm, taking a deep breath before walking to the closet. He pulled the door fully open and moved the coats aside, using the flashlight on his phone to check inside. "There's nothing in here." "Luke," Mike said, though his voice was not as confident as usual. He checked the closet floor and knocked on the back wall, but nothing happened. There was no scratching, no whisper, no cold breeze. It was just a dusty, dark closet with old coats and boxes. Luke stood up slowly, tears drying on his face, but he kept looking at the closet, expecting something to move. "I swear I heard it," Luke said softly, his voice cracking. Mike put a hand on Luke's shoulder, trying to reassure him. "Maybe you fell asleep for a second and had a bad dream," Mike suggested, but Luke shook his head. He knew what he heard. It wasn't a dream. It was real, and it felt like something was hiding in the walls, waiting for him to be alone again. Mike decided that they would stop playing hide and seek. "No more games tonight, okay?" Mike said. Luke didn't argue. They went to the living room, turning on the TV to some comedy show, hoping the sound would fill the silence that had become heavy in the house. Luke tried to focus on the TV, but every small creak from the wooden floor, every rustle of wind against the windows, made him jump. Mike tried to joke and laugh at the TV, but Luke could see that Mike kept looking toward the hallway dot after about an hour. Luke started to feel a little better, and he leaned against Mike, feeling sleepy but afraid to close his eyes. It was around 10:30 p.m. when they heard it. It was faint at first, just a soft noise, but it quickly became clear. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, careful footsteps, like someone was trying not to make noise but couldn't help the floor creaking under their weight. Luke froze, looking at Mike with wide eyes. Mike muted the TV, and the footsteps became clearer, moving from one side of the house to the other above them. Mike stood up slowly, holding his phone tightly. "It's probably the house settling," Mike whispered, but his voice was shaking, and Luke could see his cousin's hands trembling. They stood there listening as the footsteps continued. Step by step, crossing the floor above them, stopping, then starting again. Luke whispered, "It's walking." Mike didn't answer. Then, as quickly as the footsteps started, they stopped. The silence felt loud, pressing against their ears. Luke didn't want to move, but Mike slowly walked to the bottom of the stairs, looking up into the darkness. The hallway light didn't reach all the way up, and the upstairs was a shadowy tunnel. Mike turned on his phone flashlight, pointing it up the stairs, but there was nothing there. They stood there for a moment, waiting. The house was quiet again, but the silence was worse than the footsteps. Luke felt like something was watching them from the top of the stairs, hiding in the shadows, waiting for them to come up. Mike turned off the flashlight and stepped back. "Let's just stay down here," Mike said, forcing a small smile, but the quiet didn't last long. A few minutes later, there was a loud crash from the basement, like something heavy had fallen and hit the concrete floor. The sound made the floor under their feet vibrate, and Luke felt fear shoot through his body like ice. Mike jumped, looking at the basement door, which was closed but rattled slightly from the noise. "Stay here," Mike said, but Luke grabbed his arm. "Don't leave me," Luke begged, tears filling his eyes again. Mike looked at Luke, then at the basement door, and nodded. "Okay, we'll check it together." They walked toward the basement door, each step feeling like it took forever. Mike opened the door slowly, and a cold, musty smell came up from the darkness below. The wooden stairs creaked loudly as they stepped down, and the darkness seemed to swallow the small circle of light from Mike's phone flashlight. The air was cold, and Luke felt goosebumps on his arms as they reached the bottom. They saw boxes on the floor. One of them broken, its contents spilled out. It looked like it had fallen from a shelf, but neither of them had touched it. In the corner of the basement, half hidden behind an old chair, was something Luke had never noticed before. An old, tall wardrobe with dark wood, its door slightly opened. Mike and Luke looked at each other. Mike took a deep breath and walked toward the wardrobe, his flashlight shaking. Luke stayed close behind him, holding on to the back of Mike's shirt. Mike reached out and slowly pulled the wardrobe door open, the hinges squeaking loudly in the silent basement. Inside, there was nothing but an old, cracked porcelain doll sitting on the dusty wooden floor. Its glassy eyes stared straight ahead, and its mouth was slightly open as if it was about to speak. The doll was dirty, its dress torn, and one of its hands was missing. Mike shined the flashlight on it for a few seconds, then lowered the light. "It's just a doll," Mike whispered, but his voice didn't sound sure as they turned to leave. The doll fell over on its own, landing face down on the wooden floor with a soft thud. The light above them flickered once, then went out, plunging the basement into darkness. In that pitch-black silence, they heard it a whisper right next to Luke's ear. "Want to play again?" Luke felt the air freeze around him as that whisper echoed in the dark basement. It was so close that he felt it on his ear like cold breath. His whole body froze and he squeezed Mike's shirt, unable to speak. The darkness felt alive, pressing on their skin, and the smell of the basement dust, dampness, and something old filled Luke's nose, making him want to gag. Mike's phone flashlight flickered back on after a few seconds, and the small circle of light shook in Mike's trembling hand, landing on the porcelain doll that was now face down on the floor. Neither of them spoke as they stared at the doll. Luke felt tears in his eyes, but he blinked them away, afraid that if he cried, something would hear him. Mike's breathing was heavy, loud in the quiet basement, and he slowly reached down to pick up the doll. But as soon as he touched it, the light flickered again, and the sound of scratching came from the wardrobe, slow and steady, like nails dragging across wood. Luke took a step back, shaking his head, wanting to run but unable to move his legs. Mike dropped the doll, and it landed with a dull thump. "We're going back upstairs," Mike whispered, his voice rough with fear. Luke didn't argue. They turned toward the stairs, but as they took the first step, something banged inside the wardrobe hard enough that the doors rattled. Luke screamed, grabbing Mike's arm, and they both ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, the old wood creaking and cracking under their feet. Mike slammed the basement door shut behind them and locked it, leaning against it as they both tried to catch their breath. Luke felt like the walls of the house were closing in, every shadow looking darker than before, every sound sharper. Went back to the living room, turning on every light they could. The glow of the lamps made the shadows dance on the walls, but Luke felt a tiny bit safer in the light. Mike paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, mumbling, "It's just an old house, just an old house," like he was trying to convince himself it was true. They tried to watch TV again, but neither of them could focus on the screen. Luke kept looking at the hallway, expecting to see someone standing there, watching them. His ears were ringing, and every small noise in the house made him jump. Mike's phone buzzed with a message from Luke's mom saying they would be home soon, and Luke felt a small wave of relief. He just needed to wait for them to come home, and everything would be okay. But around 11:30 p.m., the lights in the house flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. The TV turned off with a pop, and the glow from the lamps disappeared, leaving them in heavy darkness. Luke felt panic rise in his chest, and he reached for Mike's hand, holding it tightly. The lights flickered back on, but the TV stayed off. And the silence felt worse than the darkness. Then, from upstairs, they heard footsteps again. Slow, heavy steps, moving across the floor above them. Mike and Luke stood still, listening, as the footsteps moved from one end of the hallway to the other, stopping above the living room. The ceiling creaked under the weight, and Luke could almost imagine someone standing right above them, waiting. The footsteps moved again, going toward the stairs, and then they heard it, the soft creak of a step on the staircase, as if someone was slowly coming down. Mike grabbed Luke's hand and pulled him toward the kitchen, whispering, "Stay quiet." They crouched behind the kitchen counter, trying to hide, as the creaking steps continued down the stairs. Luke covered his mouth with his hand, trying to control his breathing, but it was loud in his ears, each breath shaky and fast. The steps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The house was so quiet that Luke could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock and the hum of the fridge. Then there was a new sound, a soft tapping, like fingernails on wood, coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. It moved closer, each tap slow and clear, echoing off the walls. Luke squeezed Mike's hand, tears running down his cheeks now, and he felt like he was going to throw up from fear. The tapping stopped right at the entrance of the kitchen, and Luke could feel that someone or something was standing there, just out of sight. They stayed frozen, not daring to peek over the counter. The tapping started again, moving away from the kitchen, going toward the basement door. Then they heard the sound of the basement lock clicking, slowly, like it was being unlocked from the inside. The doorknob turned, creaking as it moved, and the door swung open, making a soft thud against the wall. Cold air drifted into the kitchen, and with it came the smell of the basement, damp, dusty, and sharp, like old dirt. Luke felt the cold wash over him, making him shiver so hard that his teeth chattered. The house was silent again, and Luke could hear his heart pounding in his ears. Each beat like a drum. Mike slowly peeked over the counter, his eyes wide with fear. Luke peeked too, just enough to see the hallway. The basement door was open, and the darkness inside looked deeper than before, like it was swallowing the light from the hallway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness of the basement, a shape began to appear. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it moved into the light, Luke saw it clearly. It was a small boy about Luke's age, wearing old, torn clothes, his skin pale and gray, his eyes dark and empty like two holes. His mouth was slightly open, and his head tilted as he looked around, as if he was trying to find someone. Luke's body went numb, and he couldn't breathe. The boy stepped into the hallway, dragging one foot, leaving a dark trail on the floor. Behind him, his empty eyes moved slowly until they stopped, staring directly at Luke. The boy's mouth moved, and in a soft, whispery voice he said, "Found you." Luke could not move as the pale boy stood in the hallway, staring at him with those empty, dark eyes. The boy's mouth was half open, and a soft, rattling breath came from it, like air moving through dry leaves. The torn clothes the boy wore looked like they were from another time, and they hung loosely on his thin frame. His hair was messy, sticking to his forehead, and his skin was so pale it almost looked blue under the hallway light. The dark trail behind him looked like water, but Luke could not tell what it really was. Mike grabbed Luke's hand tightly, pulling him back behind the kitchen counter. "Don't look, don't look," Mike whispered, his voice shaking. Luke squeezed his eyes shut, but the image of the boy's empty eyes burned in his mind. The house was so quiet that Luke could hear the soft ticking of the clock and the rattling of the boy's breath as it moved. Closer. Tap, drag, tap, drag. That was the sound the boy made as he moved across the hallway, dragging his foot, pausing. Every few steps like he was listening. Luke's heart was beating so fast it hurt, and he tried to cover his mouth to keep from making any sound. Tears were running down his face, but he was too scared to wipe them away. They heard the boy stop in front of the kitchen entrance. Luke could feel the cold air drifting around the corner, touching his skin, making goosebumps rise on his arms. The boy stood there for a long time, breathing softly, before he whispered in a dry, soft voice, "Do you want to play hide and seek?" Luke's body tensed, and he felt like he was going to faint. Mike shook his head, whispering, "No, no, no," under his breath, as if saying it would make the boy go away. But the boy repeated the question, a little louder this time, "Do you want to play hide and seek?" Then, silenced Luke could not take it any more and peeked over the counter. The boy was gone. The hallway was empty, and the basement door was closed again, even though neither of them had moved. The darkness was gone, replaced by the normal light from the hallway lamp, but the cold air was still there, and the strange, dark trail was still on the floor. Mike stood up slowly, pulling Luke up with him. "We need to get out of this house," Mike said, his voice firm but shaking. They moved toward the front door, trying not to look back. Luke's legs felt weak, and every step was heavy, but he kept going, holding Mike's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. As they reached the door, Luke grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't open. It was like it was locked from the outside, even though there was no lock on the inside. Mike tried, pulling harder, shaking the door, but it didn't move. Panic rose inside Luke like a wave, and he started to cry, shaking his head, saying, "Please, please, please." Suddenly, the lights in the house turned off, and they were swallowed by darkness again. Luke screamed, and Mike pulled him back from the door. The cold air became stronger, and Luke could hear footsteps behind them, slow and soft, moving closer. He turned around, and in the faint light from outside, he saw the boy standing at the end of the hallway. The boy lifted his hand and pointed at Luke, his head tilting to the side, and he whispered, "Your turn." The words felt heavy in the air, echoing in Luke's mind. The boy took a step forward, dragging his foot, and Luke felt something cold wrap around his wrist, pulling him toward the hallway. Mike grabbed Luke, trying to pull him back, but the cold grip was strong, and Luke felt himself being dragged forward. "Leave him alone," Mike shouted, but the boy did not stop. His empty eyes stared at Luke, and he opened his mouth wider, letting out a soft, rattling laugh that made Luke's skin crawl. The hallway stretched before him, looking longer than it ever had, and the shadows grew darker. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and warm light spilled into the hallway. Luke's parents stood there, looking shocked and afraid. The moment the light touched the hallway, the boy disappeared, and the cold grip on Luke's wrist vanished. Luke fell to the floor, gasping for air, as Mike pulled him into his arms. His parents rushed over, hugging Luke tightly, asking what happened, but Luke could barely speak, shaking and crying. Mike was pale, holding Luke close, telling their parents everything that happened, his voice shaking as he spoke. Luke's mom's face turned white as she listened, and she looked at Luke's dad with fear in her eyes. She explained that before they moved into the house, a boy who lived there years ago had gone missing while playing hide and seek. They searched for him for weeks, but he was never found, and the family moved away, leaving the house empty for years before Luke's family moved in. Luke's dad said it was probably just an old story, but Luke knew what he saw. That night, Luke refused to sleep in his room and stayed in the living room with his parents and Mike, all the lights on. But even with the lights, Luke felt like the shadows were watching him dot as the clock ticked past midnight. Luke started to drift off, to sleep on the couch. The room was quiet, and for a moment he felt safe. But then he heard it. Soft, slow scratching on the wall behind him, just like before, moving along the wall, coming closer to where he lay. Luke froze, his eyes wide open, listening. Then, whisper came, so soft it was like the wind, but Luke heard it clearly right next to his ear. "Your turn to hide." And the scratching continued, moving along the wall, following him, waiting for him to play again.